Today I'll be discussing Violence, Trauma, and Resiliency Among Indigenous Women by Sheila Nikashi. The outline definitions: historical oppression and trauma, resilience, ecosystematic framework, Indigenous girls, and a video. Definitions. Trauma is defined as a range of experiences that share the threat of violence and have implications for the individual's relationship with his or her larger community or life context. Trauma models should be expanded and diversified to take into the historical and current day experiences of Indigenous peoples. Some types of trauma can be amplified to Indigenous peoples include intergenerational trauma, historical trauma, race and based trauma. Given the enormous challenges faced by many Indigenous cultures to survive, resilience responses to trauma are especially notable and take many forms. Resilience in coping with traumatic events have been multiplied, defined example as the ability to return to one's original functioning following exposure to a stressful or traumatic event. Successful adaptation under challenging circumstances, and a trait of a character or personality that enables positive adaptation to adversity and to the timely attainment of psychological milestones. Example, the academic achievement, the social assistance among peers, formation of identity. Recent work suggests that resilience is a dynamic process where psychological, social, environmental, and biological factors interact, enabling individuals at any life stage to develop, maintain, or regain their mental health despite exposure to adversity. Culturally relevant definition of resilience: the experience of trauma in ethnic minority communities expresses of resilience to absorb adversity, deal with change, and continue to develop. Historical oppression and trauma. Historical oppression expands on historical trauma, a concept that includes cumulative, massive, and chronic trauma imposed on a group across generations and within the life course. Unlike historical trauma, historical oppression includes both historical and contemporary forms of oppression, including discrimination, microaggressions, everyday injustice, and demeaning messages that marginalized populations experience. Historical oppression describes the chronic, pervasive, and intergenerational experiences of oppressive that over time may be normalized, imposed, and internalized into the daily lives of many Indigenous people, including individuals, families, and communities. Historical oppression and trauma examples on Indigenous peoples include historical losses, land dispositions, possessions, death of the majority of the population through warfare and disease, forced removal and relocation, assimilation, boarding school experiences, and prohibiting religious practices such as traditional and spiritual ways. Self-respect from poor treatment from government officials, language, family ties, trust from broken treaties, culture, and people through early death. There are also losses that can be attributed to increased alcoholism. Losses have been associated with sadness and depression, anger, intrusive thoughts, discomfort, shame, fear, and distrust around white people. Massive traumas and loss is thought to lead to cumulative and unresolved grief, which can result in historical trauma response, includes suicidal thoughts, acts, IPV, depression, alcoholism, self-destructive behavior, low self-esteem, anxiety, anger, and lowered emotional expression and recognition. Historical trauma response is proposed as the psychological result of experiencing historical traumas, but the consequences of historical trauma undoubtedly transcend psychological ramifications to affect entire ethnic groups, communities, and families. Colonial and historical oppression becomes embodied through the internalized oppression and self-perpetuating through horizontal violence and sub-oppression. People desire for humanization or freedom, yet often experience violence, oppression, and dehumanization which is considered a limitation on freedom through exploitation and injustice. The mechanisms of dehumanization, the oppressor imposing choices and values through prescription, the limiting the freedom of those with less power, efforts to dominate and exploit others, which are intergenerational or transmitted, a possessive consciousness, possessive of the world and of man and woman. Suggested that social problems emerge after centuries of experiencing chronic oppression when people may feel resigned and helpless to effect change. This may lead people to be silenced, mistrustful, and understandably insecure. When people are chronically and insidiously marginalized and feel that they lack the power to change the restrictive situation, there is a tendency to strike out to those of equal or less power, for example, women, children, through horizontal violence, or to escape through substance use. This can explain why recipients of oppression may oppress fellow group members. Normalize sub-oppression as a common component of the initial stage of liberation from oppression, where there can be a certain adherence to the oppressor due to desire for their wealth and status. Resilience, overcome oppression. People must identify its causes and create a situation with a full humanity without restoring the oppressive tactics. Decolonization through expelling the oppressor's mentality by replacing it with responsibility, autonomy, and the strengths present prior to colonization. Indigenous peoples have not been merely passive recipients of historical traumas, but rather have been resisting oppression and demonstrating survivance and resilience throughout history, such as commitment to their homeland, strength of spirit, and humor. Resilience includes the ability to positively adapt despite experiencing adversity. Risk factors increase or worsen negative outcomes, whereas protective factors buffered against problems, for example, IPV and health disparities, and strengthen positive outcomes. Resilience can be assessed at individual, family, community, and cultural levels. Next is the risk and protective factors in an ecosystematic framework of historical oppression, resilience, and transcendence. The four dimensions of historical oppression and resilience and resistance of the ecosystematic framework, which enables the examination of the interactions and the interconnections among risk and protective factors across individual, couple, family, cultural, community, and societal levels. Historical oppression can be thought of as a society level risk factors that manifest itself across multiple levels. Resilience and transcendence are viewed as a multi-determined and consistently changing result of people's interactions with the environment. Framework of the historical oppression, resilience, and transcendence. The interaction, accumulation, interconnections, and the balance of risk and protective factors across multiple levels, that is, the individual, family, relational, community, and cultural, and society, predict whether a person experiences wellness balance among the mind, body, soul, and spirit after experiencing the adversity of IPV, such as the mental distress associated with IPV. Those with less power may manipulate the oppressor in hopes of obtaining power or preventing backlash. Example, if men in indigenous communities internalize the patriarchal, hegemonic, and sexist gender norms introduced through colonization, IPV will increase. It follows that leaders may become sub-oppressors, and oppressions may be perpetuated across generations with minimal external manipulation. Within the societal level factors, violence against Indigenous women, risk factors at the societal level have included historical oppression, namely colonial tactics and dehumanization tactics include cultural invasions, decades of warfare, cultural disruptions brought on through colonization, fragmenting indigenous communities against each other, and introducing adversarial gender roles to replace indigenous complementary and egalitarian gender roles, replacing indigenous belief systems about women with patriarchal and dehumanizing beliefs. Manipulation selecting leaders to engage in sub-oppression by offering them greater resources. Within the community and culture factors, contemporary experiences of oppression reported by the sub-Eastern Indigenous sample included sharecropping, attending assimilation, boarding schools, and an insidious experience of discrimination, which led to losses in the forms of cultural traditions and lives through early death. 60% of Indigenous women who experienced IPV had lost a parent by the age of 18. Cultural disruption continues to occur through widespread exposure to mainstream media influences and the imposition of prescriptive policies, prioritizing Western service structures. These service structures have clashed and competed with Indigenous worldviews, which are thought to be protected for Indigenous women. Community and cultural factors experience of discrimination and historical oppression have led community members to feel mistrustful of the gender population and services, causing them to remain silent about problems such as IPV. This silence and mistrust have been an important survival and coping response to dangerous experiences of violence, injustice, and historical oppression over time. When silence is generalized to family, it may inadvertently enable family violence and pose as a barrier to help seeking and recovery from violence. Community and cultural factors, coping mechanisms developed in response to historical oppressions may have unintentionally negative effects when generalized by individuals, families, and communities, perpetuating the problem introduced by historical oppression, for example, violence. Women have internalized into Indigenous communities, and indeed community members have described how IPV has been normalized, dehumanizing values and beliefs about women introduced by colonization and perpetuated in a patriarchal context made it difficult for women to leave violent relationships. Community and culture factors, members could blame women for being or remaining in violent situations, and IPV relationships tended to conform to the possessive ideology. Colonial missionaries impose exclusive Christian patriarchal beliefs, which have been found to be a disincentive for women to leave violent relationships. The Indigenous spiritual beliefs that held women sacred were disrupted and impaired, as was the social fabric that kept them safe. Within the family level factors, protected factor of the enculturalization was primarily transmitted through one of the most promising protective factors related to violence against Indigenous women's families. Indigenous women tend to rely on informal support systems, which is primarily comprised of family and extended family, which tend to be tight-knit, supportive, and affirming, and provide a wisdom of elders and role models. These factors tend to protect women against the effects of IPV and enable them to leave violent relationships earlier. Relational and individual factors. At the couple or relational level, having a supportive partner post-abuse was protective, whereas emotionally and physically violent partners who demonstrated dehumanizing tactics such as dominating, manipulating, using threats, using children, be controlling, following rigid particular gender roles, using substances, and demonstrating jealousy and insecurity were relational risk factors. experiencing child maltreatment, adverse childhood experiences, and teen pregnancies were emerged risk factors. Whereas women demonstrating strongly protected traits to cope with and overcome violence, such as being educationally oriented, demonstrating affirming talents, abilities, self-sufficiency, and inner strength, coping by helping others and expressing emotions, having faith, optimism, and resilience perspectives, such as learning and seeing growth from adversity. The Indigenous girls in Canada experienced the highest rates of poverty, incarceration, sexual exploitation, and gender violence, and are currently being described and murdered at epidemic rates. Centuries since Europeans first colonized Turtle Island, North America, incalculable brutality has been enacted on First Nations, with girls and women as prime targets. Despite living in one of the world's wealthiest countries, Indigenous peoples now live as second-class citizens in fourth world conditions. Canadian girls and women, they experience the highest rates of sexual and racialized violence and exploitations, incarcerations, murder, poverty, underhousing, homelessness, and underservicing in health and education. Indigenous girls, more Indigenous children, are in government care today than ever before in Canadian history. According to the United Nations State of the World's Indigenous People, 60% of the Indigenous children live below the poverty line in Canadian cities, and over half of the First Nations children live in houses that are inadequate or substandard, manifested in deteriorating units and toxic mold. Yet Indigenous children receive the least state funding, between 22% and 40% less for social services and education than non-Indigenous children. According to the Canada's Authority General, in a country as rich as Canada, this disparity is unacceptable. Colonial patriarchy. White settlers uprooted traditional spiritual and intellectual values accorded to Indigenous women and replaced them with notions of inferiority, hierarchy, and a paradigm of women as property. Rape and sexual violence are deeply embedded in the colonial mindset. Rape is more than a metaphor for colonialization. It is part and parcel of colonization. For instance, government agents would often withhold rations unless Aboriginal women were made available to them. Both Indigenous women and Indigenous lands were cast as colonial property, and both had been constructed as rapeable. Colonial policies have sought to disenfranchise women from their Indigenous status, the community leadership roles, and their access to housing and employment. Indigenous girls' traumas and deaths continue to be seen as normal and acceptable in the Canadian public realm. For example, a First Nation girl hanged herself 2 weeks before her 15th birthday. Well-being had been severely compromised by neglect, bullying, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. Numerous chronically unexplored official reports stated she was at high risk of self-harm. In her final month, a concerned school counselor predicted that the child would commit suicide without immediate help. None was given. 16 days later, she hanged herself. Indigenous girls experience based measures, complex traumas, and high risk. An entire industry of resilience, promoting programs, interventions, and specialists has been deployed. The colonial violence girls experience is reduced to psychometric measurements and assessments. For example, complex trauma, non-compliance, post-traumatic stress disorder, attachment disorder, self-harm, depression, substance use. This pathologizing in turn furthers a victim-blaming discourse. The lucky ones who survive and even thrive are called resilient, and their stories of exceptional success. Example, the disadvantaged Indigenous girl from a family of intergenerational survivors who suppress all odds to complete college are celebrated. Other girls come to be measured against the yardstick of exceptionality. Those who cannot bounce back from abuse and violence are pathologized as holding complex intergenerational trauma. This diagnostic process is rooted in evidence-based measures that typically exclude Indigenous peoples. Western-centric diagnostic procedures in turn fuel the need for more Western controlled services targeting problem Indigenous girls. This approach ignores a cruel irony, the fact that the traumas Indigenous girls experience and that the dominant system seeks to fix are produced by the system itself and by the very service providers, the social workers, educators, law enforcement officers, and so on, who have been contracted by the state to manage the Indigenous populations. Resilience-centered initiatives are translated into the positivist outcomes-focused agendas of Eurocentric neoliberal settler systems. Indigenous girls inevitably fall through the cracks. Focus on strengthening supporting system becomes quickly diluted and even harmful when it is institutionalized by large colonial systems like the child welfare, the justice systems, whose main objective is to simulation of Indigenous children. Legal violation girls experience in these systems in which they are systematically oppressed is too often obscured by individualized psychomedical conceptions of trauma that portray them as faceless and broken. Resilience, then, is the meaningless concept unless we place it in historical and political context. Focusing exclusively on girls' processes and functioning takes vital energy away from urgently needed political, policy, and economic responses to coloniality. Indigenous girls too often do not have access to the psychosocial and community capital that supports mainstream notions of resilience. For generations, effective social services have been denied and underfunded. Girls have been denied the right to participate in circles of care and positive representations of themselves and their cultures that would promote generative functioning and resilience. Demeaning representation of Indigenous women they have exposed to every day. Girls blame themselves for not resisting or contesting the violence enacted on them. Too many feel ashamed and having lost their culture and language, even though the reality is that their culture was violently and legally stolen from them. Are routinely victim blamed by authority figures, including police officers, judge, and social workers, told they were at the wrong place at the wrong time, that they made poor choices, that the intergenerational trauma they and their families' experiences simply put them at higher risk. Girls then search for evidence of resilience that they hear about in counseling groups and from social workers. They question generations of their families who are also deeply traumatized. They blame themselves for failing to meet Euro-Western development milestones that are completely disconnected from the realities of their cultural values and goals. Schools and family services, they are routinely compared to dominant markers for well-being and development that assume this is an easy assessment social network of support that might promote their resilience. So few interventions center the diverse strengths and knowledge systems of Indigenous nations. Girls turn their shame and self-blame inward and toward their own bodies and communities. They continue to internalize the racism and the misogyny that excluded the violence experienced by their mothers, grandmothers, and great-grandmothers. Right now I'll be showing you a video, what emotional abuse does to your brain.
What emotional abuse does to your brain? Emotional abuse can be more nasty. While words loses powers, they will the medical center found that emotional abuse leads to chronic stress, which is not